You're listening to China Africa Talk.
Jambo, ni Bridget akikuletea kipindi kinachohusiana na China na Afrika.
Vous écoutez le dialogue sino-africain avec Bridget.
Everything China, everything Africa.
Olá, você está ouvindo China Africa Talk com Bridget.
سيداتي وسادتي مرحبا بكم في الحوار الصيني العربي مع بريدجيت.
Welcome to this episode of China Africa Talk. I'm Bridget Mutambirwa. Starting May the 1st, 2026, China will impose zero tariffs on imports from 53 African states. We've analyzed this move in several previous episodes. Today, my colleagues Jerry Owili, Douglas Okwach, and Zawadi Mudibo take a closer look at its potential impact on the ground in Africa, exploring how the policy is not only expected to boost the volume of African exports to China, but also to improve market access, encourage value-added production, and reshape trade dynamics between China and the continent.
I just want us to start from the basics, Zawadi. Can you briefly explain what this zero-tariff policy is and what China is aiming to achieve by it?
So, I believe we need to start by understanding what a tariff is, and this is basically a tax that is imposed by a country on goods and services originating from another country, and basically this is done to help it influence it, raise services, and also protect the competitive advantage that does exist. So in effect, when we speak about the China-Africa zero tariff policy, what we really mean is that it's an arrangement which eliminates all tariffs on Chinese imports originating from Africa. So this is basically a move Beijing hopes is going to deepen economic ties between China and Africa by granting African exporters greater access to the Chinese market.
And Zawadi, so much has already been said up to this point about this policy. It's not yet taken effect yet, but from May the 1st, of course, it goes rolling. But also Africa already is engaged in other similar policies, probably with other regions of the world. So what makes this so special? From a business perspective, of course, how significant would it be compared to the other global trade incentives that African countries currently enjoy?
Well, this is quite significant because it is a zero tariff policy that applies across all 53 countries within the continent that have diplomatic ties to China. We have had other tariff measures or free tariff measures negotiated between Africa as a region and other institutions or other regions. For example, the US negotiated what is called the Africa Growth Opportunities Act, or AGOA, with Africa. And this is limited in the sense that it identifies 30-plus countries that are set to benefit from sub-Saharan Africa, and then it does also identify products, possibly there are about 1,880 products that are supposed to be traded tariff-free between sub-Saharan Africa and the US. In the case of China, the announcement of a zero-tariff policy allows every African country with a diplomatic relationship with China to be able to trade almost on 100% of available products, goods and services that it can export to China.
Thank you. And Douglas, this same conversation was the focus of the Weekend Talk Africa show. And Beatrice had a very robust conversation with two gentlemen. And of course, we also included one of the interviews that she did with one of the Kenyan PSs, that's the PS for Trade. And a lot of this conversation was focused on how then Africa can make the most of this opportunity. But even as we just now get going properly, you did, of course, in a very comprehensive manner, touch a lot of bases on this very same topic. But from your own perspective and from what you took from that discussion over the weekend, which African countries would you say, or sectors rather, stand to benefit the most from this upcoming policy?
Thank you, Jerry. That's a very good question and a good starting point. Yeah, of course, it was a memorable moment for Chinese and Kenyan investors, the Kenya-China Forum in Nairobi. And I think the sector that stands out to benefit, where benefits will almost immediately accrue, looks to me like the agricultural sector. There are a lot of products, of course, that I listened to the panelists keenly talking about. Of course, you know already between Kenya and China, avocado had a head start as a product that had accessed the Chinese market. Of course, they talked about other agricultural products like macadamia, the nuts, things like cashew nut. They talked about products like horticulture, a very, very key product. They also talked about things like fresh French beans, paper. In fact, the Chinese investor who was on the panel said this is really going to be a hot selling good because the Chinese love, spicy, hot dishes. Yeah, so agricultural sector really stands to benefit very quickly. Of course, I think also in the area of light manufacturing. But before I go into the area of light manufacturing, I think also there is also leather goods and leather products. But this needs countries with an established, livestock sector. Countries like Ethiopia, Kenya had a good history of this particular sector, but I think it's realized a downturn in recent years. The other sector that can benefit, I think, is also light manufacturing, light industries, which Chinese and Kenyan investors can set up together, either as partners or as companies. Then I also think that other things that have happened that would then make these countries and these products benefit from the sector is those that have got good infrastructure. And of course, from the meeting, I also understood that Kenya has this thing called Green Lane. Maybe Zawadi knows what it is better. It's a clearing process. Sometimes there's a backlog in exports, particularly clearing at the entry ports. So China and Kenya already have this arrangement called the Green Lane, which speeds up, processing of exports, particularly those highly perishable ones. So that's a benefit. So in my view, looks like agriculture is going to have a head start in this new tariff arrangement.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that, and also I'm so intrigued that you also mentioned Kenya in your response there. And Kenya is very significant, especially in the discussion that you're going to have today, for various reasons. One, there's already a shipment from Kenya that is targeting this same policy to China. And so a couple of days ago, the Chinese vice president was here in Kenya. And alongside Kenya's deputy president, they flagged off Kenya's first export consignment to China under the zero-tariff arrangement. And this marks, of course, a new phase in bilateral trade relations between the two countries. Now, that inaugural shipment that was flagged off from the port of Mombasa is expected to reach China before May the 1st or on May the 1st, so that it can take advantage of that zero-tariff policy. Now, what are some of the things that were in this cargo that was shipped to China? We know that there were agricultural products mostly, and you have mentioned that very vastly, Douglas. So we had avocado oil, we had avocados, the fruits, we had coffee, and we had pet pallets. And of course, this already shows just one of the sectors, as you're mentioning, agriculture, being in a very good position to take advantage of this new policy going forward. But of course, I don't think that is going to be the only thing that Africa can gain from this. So if you just expand it a little further, beyond the raw materials, what else can Africa gain from this?
I think, Jerry, listening to some of the investors and interacting with some of these investors, I think the key, what is going to unlock Kenya-China trade, and of course, we are also trying to find a balance. Value addition is very key. And I think the mantra now is moving from raw to semi-processed to processed and stuff like that. So what I gather, what I understand that these investments are going to focus on more is to value add. That means setting up those light industries I was talking about. Because in value addition, we don't just send green tea, coffee. So we can send roasted berries. We can send packaged tea. Even our nuts can be semi-processed. They can be roasted and packaged. Actually, one of the one of the investors was talking about selling brands. So which brand, so he was talking about brands. In that sense, therefore, I think the motto between Kenya and China with regard to this arrangement is that let's move away from raw to processed, because that way Kenya stands to benefit not just in terms of foreign exchange, but also in job creation and also technology transfer. We know when we process, we set up industries that then create jobs, and unemployment is a big issue in African countries. And then there's also going to be technology transfer. So I see that by and by, as time goes by, and as more and more Kenyan and Chinese investors set up processing plants, we are slowly going to move away from exporting raw to exporting processed, including in areas like textiles. Leather also, so that is the direction I think this engagement is going to go into.
Zawadi, China is a big opportunity for Africa in terms of market space, and it's a vast opportunity for the continent also to, just further its trade ambitions. But it's not going to be a walk in the park. Looking at everything that China stands for. And a lot of other regions as well already access that market. So it's not going to be a walk in the park for Africa and for the African entities that are going to aim to take advantage of this new zero-tariff policy. So let's talk regulation and standards. Now, when you consider China's highly competitive market space, what is it that you think Africa has to do to ensure its products are admissible there?
Now, you started by mentioning something important about this market available to Africa vis-a-vis other regions that already access the Chinese market. One advantage of the China-Africa zero-tariff policy is to give African exporters a competitive advantage over exporters from other regions. It means that they are able to access that market relatively cheaper or in an affordable way compared to other markets. And this gives them an opportunity to be able to invest in value chains more and also grow that particular Chinese market. And now coming back to the question around what Africa must do, I think the question of trade facilitation now comes into question at this point, because then there are issues that African authorities need to look into, such as simplifying custom procedures and also ensuring that inspection protocols looked into and simplified for exporters that engage. And then the other aspect that must be considered is negotiating bilaterally, because this is a blanket policy for the whole of Africa, but it does not translate into any exporter, random exporter from any of the 53 African countries does not mean they can now pick up their produce or their goods and services and begin to access that market tariff-free from 1st of May. Governments of specific countries must now take the initiative to negotiate bilateral terms and have protocols that are agreed between China and the specific country, which will then determine how exporters within that particular jurisdiction are able to access the market. For example, we saw in Kenya, in South Africa, there was a negotiation that took place of what is called the early harvest agreement. And this allowed, in the case of Kenya, for example, over 98% of its farm produce and horticulture, food produce and horticulture accessing this market even before the full implementation of the zero-tariff policy. It does mean that then, for instance, horticulture and food products had been attracting a tariff of between 10 to 25% before now. And now all that is zero-rated. Look at tea, which is Kenya's biggest export beverage. Tea has had a tariff to it of between 6 and 10%, depending on what market within China you access and what duration of export and season. That has now been zero-rated. So it is very important that the technocrats in these institutions or African governments now take the initiative to speak to Beijing and make sure that they have protocols agreed for their specific jurisdictions.
Now, I like the direction this conversation is taking. Already it's evident from what we have discussed so far that agriculture is going to be a major topic of discussion, and it's going to be a major focal point even for this policy going forward. And I want us to stay on that same course that we have taken. Now, not only is agriculture the backbone of Africa's economy, it is also a major employer. It employs roughly 65% of the continent's labor force and contributes between 30 to 60% of the continent's GDP. But sadly, while Africa holds roughly 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, it faces significant productivity challenges due to the heavy reliance on rain-fed smallholder farming and low technology adoption. Kind of a reverse of what China does with in terms of including even AI and smart technology in agriculture and in farming and even beyond farming. So with these considerations, Awadi, I have two questions. One, I'm really interested in knowing how big an opportunity this is then for the continent going forward in terms of the opportunities that might come up. And also, what are some of the potential products we could see take the most advantage from this new policy when it takes effect on May the 1st?
So let me give you some context first. We have Africa's exports to China have traditionally been concentrated around low-value primary products. And looking at the type of products that are traded with China between Africa and China. Now, in terms of the composition, we have raw materials and natural resources, which remain very dominant exports from Africa to China. I'll give you an example. In 2023, we had China's leading exports from the least developed countries in Africa being mineral resources, which accounted for 40% of the bilateral trade that was recorded. These were also closely followed by non-edible materials and finished products, also categorized as raw materials, each splitting the 30% share of that market. So Africa's, as a continent, in terms of its reliance on raw exports or raw materials such as crude oil, copper, cobalt, iron ore, while imports from China have largely been finished value-added products, and that has meant a significant trade imbalance. In fact, there are estimates that indicate the trade imbalance between Africa and China in 2025 was at least $60 billion. Now, for this initiative to have been announced, we need to recognize the fact that China is now ready to lose $1.4 billion in terms of the tax revenue it would have received had it not implemented this program. So it means that before this zero tariff regime, China has had access to at least $1.4 billion in revenues from taxes from imports from Africa. Your question around the potential products that we could see take advantage, I will still circle back to what we mentioned and what Douglas spoke about, which is agricultural products, because Africa is largely an agrarian economy. And looking at these products, talk about avocados, coffee, nuts, and we're talking about cashew nuts, ground nuts, tea exports, horticulture, a wide range of horticultural products. We have a little bit of textile and apparel, and processed goods such as chocolate from West African giants like Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. All these are aimed at bolstering Africa's export value. Now, Africa's largely agrarian economy has only been able to export 3.3% of its total products. So the value of agricultural products to China, the latest figure I have is from 2023, the value of agricultural products was just about 3 to 4%, which means raw materials and all these mineral resources took the wider chunk. Yet, our biggest potential as Africa is agriculture. So it means we have a potential of expanding trade by over 95%. So this is astronomical, and it also means that there needs to be significant investments within the continent. Douglas talked about the Green Channel, which was a constituent of the Forum for Africa. It's called the FOCAC, Forum on Africa-China Cooperation, in 2021, when China committed to roll out the Green Channel to allow quicker processing of agricultural products from African markets to access the Chinese market. And there were levels and stages of zero-tariff access that were rolled out from 2023. Now that has been expanded to all the 53 African countries. What that means then is this massive opportunity is now in the hands of African farmers, African governments, and all the technocrats along this agricultural value chain to make good of this opportunity, because it means there are certain things that need to be discussed. You need to discuss standards between China and Africa. Africa will say, or let's take an example of South Africa. South Africa will say, we have citrus, we have plums, we have all these types of fruits that we can export to China. And then China will say, if you need to bring these products to our market, these are the standards that you must meet. This is where now the phytosanitary standards for food products come in. And these products reaching those standards standards require certain levels of inspection, certain levels of compliance.
Yeah, Jerry, I'd just like to weigh in there on the phytosanitary standards, because it's really a key issue in China, Kenya, or China-Africa trade. The issue of standards, the issue of compliance, it then becomes an non-tariff barrier if these standards are not met, if there's no compliance. And it comes to back home in Africa or in Kenya to questions of policy, because at the forum, discussions came around the question of training farmers in terms of what they need to do in order to be able to meet these standards. The details of those trainings were not quite clear, but of course there was a lot of emphasis, and that's why we see in the past Kenya has had some setbacks in terms of its access to the EU market, specifically because some of these standards were not met. Then therefore the environment in which we grow these crops that we want to export to China, the herbicides we use, the pesticides we use, the general agricultural area terrain, in terms of what somebody else in the neighborhood is doing on their farm, really matters. For me, then, this requires a major policy shift in terms of how we manage agricultural land. And of course, you also spoke about transiting from rain-fed to irrigation, because of climatical factors which have become more and more unpredictable. So we need to transition more to growing around the year as opposed to growing during seasons. Of course, we also need to move from traditional ways of cultivating land to more mechanized, machine-driven farms. And I think in that forum, there was a lot of discussion on Chinese equipment that can quickly be used to make that transition, not just in Kenya, but across Africa.
So we all agree the potential is there and the opportunity now is here. How confident are you then that Africa can make the most out of it?
Well, already it's quite obvious, if you look at countries like Kenya, they already, if you look at the avocado experiment, and it quickly pushed up Kenya-China trade with quite substantial percentages. So that is already a gain, and in terms of moving towards, from raw to semi-processed or fully processed agricultural goods, that is already being done in some countries. And I think that's the emphasis. But also beyond, to benefit means Africa has to do a lot on its side. Also, the movement of these agricultural products from areas in which they are grown, the infrastructure connection, the roads, the accessibility of the market, the speed with which these highly perishable goods like horticulture need to reach China means we have to do something about our infrastructure. And if you look at the countries that are already benefiting, like South Africa, like Morocco, like Kenya, they have done a lot in terms of infrastructure. So it's not just a question of standards, it's also a question of how fast those goods can be moved. And these are really important. So the ball really is on the African side in terms of what needs to be done to speed up market access and to meet those phytosanitary standards that China requires to access its market.
And yeah, you're mentioning the example of Kenya's avocados now accessing China's market, and of course how that contributes then to the trade environment between Kenya and China. Zawadi was earlier on talking about AGOA. Would you, off the top of your head, have any other examples of success stories of other instances that have been successful in terms of Africa relating to any other region successfully, trade-wise, in a manner that the continent benefited, and something that probably would offer a lesson even as this new policy now takes effect?
I think the Ethiopia export processing zone is a very good example to talk about. And I think at CGTN Africa, we have repeatedly covered that story. You know, the idea of putting all these processes together under an export processing zone is a good example to give. Then we also have the Mauritius Free Trade Agreement, you know, the Mauritius-China free trade arrangement, and how it boosted, you know, trade between Mauritius and China. South Africa's exports to China have recorded progressive growth over the years because in addition to meeting these standards, the infrastructure, the logistics that allow South Africa to quickly get into markets are also there. Morocco is another example. Yeah, so I think these things are moving in the right direction in terms of what Africa needs to do in order to access the Chinese market and the support China needs to give Africa in order to realize this in terms of technology, for example.
Zawadi, what other challenges would you say do you foresee potentially becoming a problem for the rollout of this new policy?
I'd say that the primary beneficiaries of this tariff-free trade zone are going to be countries that are significantly developed in terms of their agricultural value chains and, you know, the infrastructure that supports the movement of goods and services from rural ecosystems, the ability to export. And we have seen already, if you look at the countries that already have had discussions on early harvest agreements, Kenya, South Africa. So this tells you countries like Kenya, South Africa, and Douglas mentioned Morocco are already poised to begin taking advantage of this. But the flip side of it is the least developed economies, which do not have as properly, set out infrastructure, and that will mean that they now begin to lose even that capacity that they were already enjoying, that free market access that they were already enjoying. They are hampered by infrastructure and also the limited export capacity. So this also risks meaningful advantages to these countries. Now, the other aspect that is very pertinent to most least developed countries, and these are the majority on the continent, is the fact that a lot of our agricultural practices is really about subsistence farming. Most people farm to feed their families and take the little surplus to the next market to sell. Now you're telling these people, who are more than 75% of farmers on the continent, that they can now sell to China. The question around aggregation comes up, but it becomes complicated because you cannot aggregate different farms on the same standard. For this zero policy to work, you need to have large-scale mechanized agriculture. So it's really about communal farming. And I wish there were opportunities for most of these African countries to be able to go back to that land system. This was a land system that existed mostly prior to colonial era, where you have an entire village or an entire community deciding this is where we are going to make our habitation, and then the rest of the land is going to be communally farmed. this is the best way forward for Africa. So then it means that because the land policy is very complex and it's very different, and land is a very pertinent issue for Africans. It talks about, hereditary land, talk about land that is seen as sacred to a community or to a family. Then governments now need to look back and say, for example, if you look at countries like Kenya, we have had institutions such as the Agriculture Finance Corporation. We have had government land that has been used for research in agricultural activity. How can we consolidate this land and even fallow land in arid and semi-arid areas, put it under irrigation and be able to produce on large scale? This will be the game changer.
Yeah, Jerry, if you allow me, let me just weigh in on what Zawadi is saying, and I think I had mentioned this in our previous show. It's about producing at scale. It's really pointless to be able to export avocados today, and tomorrow we have run out of avocados to export to China, just because our avocado production is not sufficient to meet the market needs, the Chinese market needs. So how do we produce at scale to satisfy this market, this huge market of 1-point-something billion people, where there is a demand of all sorts of agricultural products? So that's a key concern and a key question that needs to be addressed. And of course, our land practices, our land use practices haven't been very helpful, like Zawadi has pointed out. I talked about previously here about fragmentation, that increasingly what we are seeing, not just in Kenya but across Africa, is the rapid subdivision of what used to be food baskets into settlements. So what used to be agricultural land is now being subdivided to develop settlements. This, of course, will be a challenge, and it really boils down to land policy. The land laws we have in many African countries that prohibits, the use of private land by government, even if there is a need, and requires a lot of compensation. And secondly, and I think East African Community is a very good example where we have achieved, there are about 5 levels of integration in any regional economic community. And I think East African Community is one of those REXs that have achieved a very high level of integration, but we still fall short when it comes to monetary union, which is the second highest level of integration. We have a customs union, but we need a monetary union, the use of common currency. Of course, the highest then is the political federation, but that could be a pipe dream. Because then what we achieve at the regional integration level, at the REX level, is then what builds the Africa trading bloc, the common Africa the Africa-wide trading bloc that the FCFTA that we aspire to. So these are incremental, developments that begin at the regions. Of course, also we need to think of infrastructure in terms of regional infrastructure as opposed to national infrastructure, so that our railways, our roads have a regional plan in them for connectivity across the continent.
And I want us to zoom out a bit now. We have dwelled so much on the African side and how Africa stands to benefit, how Africa should, how Africa should take advantage of this, what it must do to ensure that this policy is beneficial to the whole continent and to its population. We have talked so much on that. I want us to flip this script a bit and look at the Chinese side. Of course, China is not just doing this because they want to, they don't have anything to gain from it. Of course, there's going to be a part that they're going to benefit from that, and I want us to also look at that. Douglas, I get the feeling that this is yet another springboard for China-Africa relations. It's a way, or rather a mode, to further it even deeper. What do you think?
Yeah, same old story, Jerry, same old story. I think it's something we have talked about for year after year. China's manufacturing has reached a level which then requires that the country begin looking into other sectors, moving from manufacturing relocating that manufacturing to other countries. And I think that is how China also built itself. So I think there is an opportunity here, a very big opportunity here, for Chinese investments to look at investing in Africa in terms of transferring technology, transferring the manufacturing here. So the investments that we are talking about within the context of this zero-tariff regime that is coming up in May is one where we want to see more Chinese manufacturing starting at the value addition level. And this means transferring some of the manufacturing here, transferring some of the equipment here, transferring some of the technology here. And it's also a very good forum for people-to-people exchange. And I think this is a very important year for China and Africa in terms of people-to-people exchange. So it's about partnering in investment, in manufacturing, so that we get both the knowledge and the technology to begin doing it ourselves. Then that way we will easily move away from raw to value addition in terms of what we export. So for me, it's a very old story. It's just a question of, so when can this begin to happen? Is it already happening? Of course, yes, in some places, in some sectors. But it should now be the norm, not the exception.
So Zawadi, of course, I assume you agree with Douglas and myself. When these Chinese entities come here, definitely the African producer benefits. When the African producer benefits at the very beginning, they have an opportunity to scale up their operations, whether it's farming, whether it's any other thing that they're going to be doing, targeting the Chinese market. I just want you to also look at it now from the other side. Beyond the goods that Africa then is going to be taking to China that will be received in the Chinese market, how else does China stand to gain from this new policy?
Well, China gains from the onset by eliminating those tariffs. For example, we have the opportunity to see the value chain incentivized, in the sense that now African countries and producers and entities begin to look at themselves not as competitors, but as partners in trade. It gives us an opportunity as Africa to be able to stop what we call the tariff arbitrage and to potentially boost manufacturing exports and trade integration within the continent. I'm talking about, let's say, the tea farming value chain. You have Burundi, you have Rwanda, you have Uganda, you have Kenya, and parts of Ethiopia farming tea. Do you want to have processing plants in all these countries? Probably not. We talked about the regional economic zones. Why don't we have a significant value addition entity or manufacturing plant centrally placed within the region to take in produce from all these countries, and then you export as one, so that then the farmer from Burundi and the Great Lakes region already benefits by having a guaranteed market to the processing plant. And the processing plant then knows it has a guaranteed value-added market by selling value-added products to China. And then you talked also about how else China stands to benefit. So there are opportunities that will come in the sense of foreign direct investment. If Chinese businessmen and investors want to invest in the local production value chain, that means a direct injection of capital in these economies within the African continent. If you want to do a chocolate manufacturing or value addition company in Ivory Coast or in Ghana, that is already an opportunity to invest within the continent and gives the specific country foreign direct investment. And beyond that, we have the whole concept of supply chain adjustments that allow for production and processing centers to be able to be the entry point into the Chinese market, as I had mentioned, and also to allow businesses to be able to invest significant amounts of money without spending too much on tariffs because they are investing under a zero-tariff regime.
And the 53 African countries that are included in this deal, what is it that their governments could do to, just further to ensure that this policy is beneficial to the continent? Of course, there's already the obvious bits of it, but then starting it and sustaining it in a successful manner might need government intervention and very concerted efforts by the governments from these 53 African countries to ensure that this opportunity remains open for the long term. What do you think then they can do to ensure that that is so?
There are specific interventions that need to be considered. One is the issue of identifying their high-value products that can fit into this zero-tariff regime, and then invest in those value chains, get to the agricultural extension officers. When we were growing up, they were a common feature in the villages. They are not anymore. This is time for the ministries of agriculture, departments of agriculture to begin to invest in professionalizing agriculture and mechanizing and modernizing agriculture. So get professionals to speak to farmers, to train farmers, get what is called farm inputs that are already subsidized where necessary, so that farmers do not stretch themselves so thin to be able to get into investing in farming. Make it possible for farmers to look at agriculture as a business rather than as a source of livelihood. Let them look at agriculture as an opportunity to transform lives, to transform economies, not just at their local centers, but also at a country level. I mentioned at the top of our program that Africa is generally and widely an agrarian economy, which means we have greater potential in agriculture than we do have in mineral resources. Much as there is too much focus on mineral resources and to a large extent ignoring the potential that we have in our land, in our seas, in our water bodies, and in different aspects of the agricultural economy.
Thank you. Allow me to drag you into something rather new for this podcast, gentlemen. So I want to drag you into a rapid question and answer session as we just approach the tail end of this discussion. I'm starting with you, Zawadi. Very briefly, what is that one sector that Africa should watch closely?
Well, I'll stick with the agricultural sector because particularly due to the potential of investments that will arise in mechanizing agriculture and also, including the setting up of local industries to contribute to value addition.
And to you, Douglas, what is that one country that you predict might gain the most from this new policy?
I think South Africa is already gaining a lot and is ahead of all other African countries in terms of trade with China. And I also stick with agriculture in terms of the product that would then enable it to access the largest share of the Chinese market and, of course, earn it a lot of revenue.
Back to you, Zawadi. What's the biggest misconception you have had so far about this policy?
Well, I reckon that the assumption that the China-Africa zero-tariff policy means producers starting to sell their produce to China arbitrarily. No, that is not the case, and that is a misconception. There has to be protocols agreed bilaterally between countries, between your specific African country and the Chinese Commerce Department, so that then you outline what products are going to be traded under this regime from your country.
And Douglas, looking ahead, how would you describe the long-term impact of this new zero-tariff policy that takes effect on May the 1st?
Well, it's a milestone. It's a very, very, very important development in terms of Kenya-China trade, where access has been an issue because of tariffs. Naturally, when there are tariffs, it means not many goods can access the market. Even if you look at South Africa, which has the highest trade volumes with China, you'll see that this zero tariff will help it eliminate up to 20% tariffs on some goods. So I think the elimination of tariffs will play a big role in finding the balance, even if we don't achieve actual balance, but we will get somewhere nearer in finding the balance of trade between China and Africa. So for me, that is the biggest thing. And secondly, I think it's also going to work towards transferring more Chinese investments, particularly in the agricultural sector and technology.
And with that comes employment. With that
Of course, absolutely.
Skills transfer for Africa, which is much needed as we try to industrialize and catch up to the rest of the world.
Yes, correct.
You can find this episode on YouTube and Spotify. Search Talk Africa Plus. Stay with our program China Africa Talk to get to know more stories about China and Africa and their expanding bilateral cooperation. You can subscribe to our online newsletter on CGTN or Substack to get more insights on China-Africa relations. Just search China Africa Talk. For now, it's goodbye. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others. Post it on social media or leave a rating and review. Thanks again. See you next time.